What empire was ruled by Julius Caesar before it became an empire? Roman Republic. Which 20th century event began with the stock market crash of 1929? Great Depression. What was the US Supreme Court decision that ended racial segregation in schools? Brown v. Board of Education. What economic theory was proposed by John Maynard Keynes? Keynesian economics. Which country launched the first artificial satellite? Soviet Union. What was the name of the first artificial satellite? Sputnik. Who was the first woman Prime Minister of India? Indira Gandhi. What US military strategy was used in the Pacific during World War II? Island hopping. Who was the famous Egyptian queen known for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? Cleopatra. What political scandal led to Richard Nixon's resignation? Watergate. Which philosopher wrote The Republic? Plato. Who was the commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II? Dwight D. Eisenhower. What was the name of the economic system based on private ownership and profit? Capitalism. Which event marked the start of World War I? Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Who led the March on Washington in 1963? Martin Luther King Jr. What is the term for the policy of racial segregation in South Africa? Apartheid. Which invention by Eli Whitney revolutionized cotton production? Cotton gin. Who was the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire? Romulus Augustulus. Which war was fought over religion in Europe from 1618 to 1648? 30 Years' War. What event in 1917 brought the US into World War I? Zimmermann telegram and unrestricted submarine warfare. Which war resulted from the US? Doctrine of Manifest Destiny, Mexican-American War. What was the name of the brutal regime in Cambodia during the 1970s? Khmer Rouge. Who led the nonviolent struggle for civil rights in the US? Martin Luther King Jr. What was the name of Hitler's plan to eliminate the Jews of Europe? Final Solution. Which revolution resulted in the overthrow of Louis XVI? French Revolution. What island did Napoleon escape from before returning to power in 1815? Elba. What alliance was formed in 1882 between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy? Triple Alliance. Which US president declared war on Japan in 1941? Franklin D. Roosevelt. What period in European history emphasized humanism and art? Renaissance. What was the military alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire in World War I? Central Powers. Who was the first female British Prime Minister? Margaret Thatcher. What war ended with the Treaty of Ghent in 1814? War of 1812. Which leader promoted glasnost and perestroika in the Soviet Union? Mikhail Gorbachev. What was the strategy of building up nuclear arms during the Cold War called? Arms race. What is the term for the medieval practice of granting land in exchange for loyalty? Feudalism. What was the trade system involving Africa, Europe, and the Americas called? Triangular trade. What global conflict occurred from 1939 to 1945? World War II. What was the name of the US project that developed the atomic bomb? Manhattan Project. Who led the first successful slave revolt in the Americas? Toussaint Louverture. Which event led directly to US involvement in World War II? Attack on Pearl Harbor. What was the term for the division between communist and non-communist Europe? Iron Curtain. Who was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party during the Long March? Mao Zedong. What document outlines the fundamental laws of the United States? US Constitution. What was the cultural revival in Europe during the 14th to 17th centuries? Renaissance. Which explorer circumnavigated the globe? Ferdinand Magellan. What was the policy of détente aimed at during the Cold War? Easing tensions between the US and USSR. Who led the Soviet Union during World War II? Joseph Stalin. What was the name of the conflict between Israel and Arab states in 1973? Yom Kippur War. Which peace agreement ended apartheid and led to democratic elections in South Africa? Interim Constitution of 1993. Which battle in 1066 resulted in the Norman conquest of England? Battle of Hastings. Who was the first emperor of China? Qin Shi Huang. What was the medieval code of conduct followed by knights? Chivalry. Which treaty ended the War of 1812 between the US and Britain? Treaty of Ghent. Who was the first president of independent Kenya? Jomo Kenyatta. What was the name of the movement to unify Germany in the 19th century? German Unification. What is the name of the 18th century intellectual movement emphasizing reason and science? Enlightenment. Which US president issued the Emancipation Proclamation? Abraham Lincoln. What is the name of the ship that famously sank in 1912? Titanic. Which South American liberator helped free Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia? Simon Bolivar. What treaty ended the 30 Years' War in 1648? Treaty of Westphalia. What African empire was known for its advanced metallurgy and art? Benin Empire. What was the 1948-1949 operation to supply West Berlin called? Berlin Airlift. Who was the US president during the Cuban Missile Crisis? John F. Kennedy. What Chinese rebellion lasted from 1850 to 1864 and caused millions of deaths? Taiping Rebellion. Who was the leader of Nazi Germany? Adolf Hitler. What country was divided into East and West after World War II? Germany. Which philosopher wrote 2 treatises of government? John Locke. What was the term for the Ottoman elite infantry made up of enslaved boys? Janissaries. What major empire ruled over India before British colonization? Mughal Empire. Who was the founder of the religion of Islam? Prophet Muhammad. What explorer reached India by sea around the Cape of Good Hope? Vasco da Gama. What is the term for the rebirth of interest in classical learning and arts? Renaissance. Who was the first democratically elected president of Russia? Boris Yeltsin. Which battle in 1815 ended Napoleon's rule? Battle of Waterloo. What 1945 conference established the United Nations? San Francisco Conference. What was the name of the British passenger ship sunk by a German U-boat in 1915? Lusitania. What was the American policy to prevent the spread of communism during the Cold War? Containment. Who developed the theory of general relativity? Albert Einstein. What was the name of the protest against British taxes by American colonists in 1773? Boston Tea Party. Which war was sparked by Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia? World War I. Who was the Egyptian president during the Suez Crisis? Jamal Abdel Nasser. What was the name of the Soviet economic policy aimed at restructuring? Perestroika. Which US president ended slavery with the 13th Amendment? Abraham Lincoln. What was the movement to end slavery called? Abolitionism. Who succeeded Lenin as leader of the Soviet Union? Joseph Stalin. What ancient civilization developed cuneiform writing? Sumerians. Which war was fought between North and South Korea from 1950 to 1953? Korean War. What is the term for a system of government in which power is held by the people? Democracy. Who was the longest reigning monarch in British history? Queen Elizabeth II. Which leader implemented the Great Purge in the Soviet Union? Joseph Stalin. What battle marked the turning point of the Pacific Theater in World War II? Battle of Midway. Which country built the Great Wall to protect against northern invasions? China. What was the name of the U.S. policy to provide military aid to countries resisting communism? Truman Doctrine. Who discovered the Americas for Spain in 1492? Christopher Columbus. What was the name of the French prison stormed in 1789? Bastille. Who led Yugoslavia during the Cold War as a non-aligned communist? Josip Broz Tito. What ancient empire was ruled by emperors such as Augustus and Nero? Roman Empire. What was the major religious conflict between Christians and Muslims in the medieval period? Crusades. What year did India gain independence from Britain? In the year 1947. What African American woman helped slaves escape through the Underground Railroad? Harriet Tubman. What was the name of the peace treaty that ended World War I? Treaty of Versailles. Who was the South African president who released Nelson Mandela from prison? F.W. de Klerk. What war did the US fight in Southeast Asia from the 1950 to the 1970? Vietnam War. What pandemic swept through Europe in the 14th century? Black Death. What was the name of the US military invasion of Iraq in 2003? Operation Iraqi Freedom. Which US general later became president after leading troops in World War II? Dwight D. Eisenhower. What was the name of the conflict that divided Ireland in the 20th century? The Troubles. Who was the first emperor of the Roman Empire? Augustus Caesar. Which Chinese dynasty built much of the existing Great Wall? Ming Dynasty. What was the name of the military conflict in the 1860 that ended slavery in the US? American Civil War. Who was the Queen of England during the Spanish Armada? Elizabeth I. Which empire conquered Constantinople in 1453? Ottoman Empire. Who founded the religion of Buddhism? Siddhartha Gautam. What was the name of the ancient Greek city known for its military discipline? Sparta. Who painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? Michelangelo. What 20th century US law prohibited discrimination based on race? Civil Rights Act of 1964. Which explorer claimed Canada for France? Jacques Cartier. What was the name of the long conflict between England and France from 1337 to 1453? 100 Years' War. Who was the military leader and emperor who spread French influence across Europe? Napoleon Bonaparte. Which civilization developed the first known code of law? Babylonians. What was the capital of the Inca Empire? Cusco. Who led the Haitian Revolution? Toussaint Louverture. What was the term for German submarine warfare in World War I? U-boat campaign. Which empire ruled over much of Eastern Europe and the Middle East for centuries? Ottoman Empire. Who was the US president during the Great Depression and World War II? Franklin D. Roosevelt. What was the name of the Nazi secret police? Gestapo. What alliance formed after World War II to resist Soviet expansion? NATO. Which historical figure was executed for opposing the Church's teachings on heliocentrism? Giordano Bruno. Who was the Roman general assassinated on the Ides of March? Julius Caesar. What was the name of the rebellion that sought to end the Qing dynasty in China? Boxer Rebellion. What was the name of the code of laws developed by Napoleon? Napoleonic Code. Who was the revolutionary leader in Cuba in the 1950s? Fidel Castro.